Shivani Gupta is an entrepreneur, a professional speaker, and an 8 times published author. She comes to entrepreneurship from a corporate background, so she has a really unique view on the world. And interestingly, her story starts with an unexpected personal pilgrimage to Nepal and a fascinating meeting with a young child.
He took a suck of his lollipop, he broke it in half, and he gave her half the lollipop. And then he took his lollipop, he put it back into the wrapper, and he put it into his pocket. And I remember, I could see his face anytime I shut my eyes, and he looked at me as if I had just given him $1 million. And I just went, I want what he has. And so in the first week I got back from Nepal, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I was very clear about what I was not going to do. And so I left my corporate job and I left my relationship. Mom, I love you, but Dad's got this corporate job and you've got this, you risk everything, then you borrow against the house, then your business almost, went under in COVID. And she said, I love you, but I'm not sure I could be an entrepreneur. And I remember thinking, I'm just doing the same thing again. I'm back doing this corporate path. I've just called it my own business. I'm super stressed. I'm working crazy hours. I'm getting up in the middle of the night. I'm worrying about my key talent leaving me. What am I doing here? I've just recreated the same life, but just under a different umbrella. I'm just telling myself this is better because I'm working for myself and not some corporate whatever giant. And this is better, but my behaviours and my lifestyle is exactly the same. And he said, well, my experience has been, Shivani, that when you're suffering, you serve. And when you serve, it lessens your suffering. And I think, that there's that saying that your values are not tested when everything's going well. Your values are tested when everything's going shit. I had set myself a pretty unrealistic goal of 10xing the business. It was nowhere near that in the first few years. And I had said, when I 10x it,
Shivani Gupta, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So great to have you here. Just arrived on a plane fresh from Australia. We get to have this conversation. How cool.
We've been talking about this for 2 years, I think, Josh. Here we are.
And here we are.
Yeah.
So I want to get this right, but you were an electrical engineer, then you did an MBA, you became a senior manager, then suddenly you're a leadership coach, a spa owner, an author, a speaker, a TV business expert. Was there any point in time that your family sat you down and said, look, Shivani, can you just sort it out and make one decision on the career that's right for you, please?
I think, Josh, if I had sat down with my very traditional Indian family, I would still be back in the corporate world.
Okay.
My family were not very excited about my decision to leave a very stable, high-paying corporate life. That's what they felt, that they had been successful as immigrants into Australia. And so my decision was really based on the place where we last met, which was Nepal. So just over 20 years ago, I had already cancelled my trip to Nepal several times because of the corporate life, and I was finding it more and more difficult to take time out. I was doing very long hours, feeling fairly burnt out, this utopia of getting to the senior level position, getting paid lots of money, having shares, the corner office, etc. Wasn't quite panning out the way that I'd imagined. And I remember then finally getting to Nepal, but because it was just after September 11, when I got to Nepal, everybody else had cancelled their trip. So I arrived in Nepal for a month, walking around the Annapurna Ranges, nothing serious like base camp, and everybody else had cancelled their trip. So it was me with a Sherpa, a guide, and a cook for a month. So we would walk for a few hours, and because they spoke little English, I spoke fluent Hindi, but I spoke very little Nepali. I had a lot of time to be silent. And it was probably the first time in my life, I think, I'd had opportunities to reflect and think. I cried a lot. I interacted a lot with locals. I interacted a lot with kids. And there were probably 2 or 3 specific stories I remember of little kids that invited me into their huts when they had nothing, and their mother, who was just carving out some rice and salt for their food, who just carved out a little bit more for me. And I remember thinking, why are these people so happy? Why am I not more satisfied? Why am I not more content? Look how much I have. And I remember just thinking, that's because I'm just not doing what I really want to do. So I didn't tell my family that I was going to quit. I was also in a fairly mediocre relationship. That was like a
Like a life
beige
partnership. Yeah.
5 out of 10
Right.
kind of relationship.
Mhm.
And so in the first week I got back from Nepal, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I was very clear about what I was not going to do.
Mm.
And so I left my corporate job and I left my relationship.
Wow. In the space of the next month of returning back to Australia.
Like a week and a bit. And so when we met in Nepal, obviously since then I'd partnered and married Scott, and we've got 2 beautiful children. And before we went to Nepal, he called a little family meeting. He's like, so the last time you went to Nepal, you quit everything. We're just checking in. You're happy with the marriage?
Do we need to pull the risk
You're happy
management
with it?
register up?
Is there anything that we need to talk about? I said, I think you're good. I think there's other changes that need to be made. And I've traveled back to Nepal 3 times, and each time it's been quite a transformational place for me.
Incredible. I love that story. Now, one of the things our research had dug up is that you were actually the first female in your lineage that had a career, let alone a very successful corporate career. So that adds more heat to the fact that you then went to your family and said that, hey, this is what I'm looking to do, leave my marriage. But do you mind if I ask, was it an arranged marriage, by the way?
No.
Okay. So
Which was
modern,
worse.
traditional. Right. We
because
told
I'm
you.
like, we told you so. We told you so.
You would have left it
And
to
you
us.
did it. Yeah, we could have done it because my mum had already sued us organised. And so I think there was a lot of shame that I felt at the time around my relationship specifically, because it was something I had rushed into to avoid the arranged marriage. And, full responsibility. I wasn't a child. I was an adult, very young adult, but I was an adult and I made that decision. So that carried a lot of shame. In terms of going back to the lineage, I just think that that's really significant for me. I'm the first entrepreneur in my family, and I'm the first female in my lineage to work. My mum has a degree but hasn't worked. She's volunteered and done different things. Some of my aunties, my grandmother. And so I don't look at that as a weight for me, Josh. For me, that's quite a privilege. And it's something that for a daughter who's now 17, final year of school, going to be 18 later this year, it's also been a really important thing for me as a mum to talk about that with my children. To say, for my son to expect that his partner, will be working, and for my daughter to really look at that and say, well, you have choices, in terms of what you want to do. I remember a few years ago, she said to me, Mom, I love you, but, Dad's got this corporate job and you've got this, you risk everything, then you borrow against the house, then your business almost, went under in COVID. And she said, I love you, but I'm not sure I could be an entrepreneur. And I went, oh, that's fair enough. I get it. I get
I
that.
don't think most people can.
You might want to do more of what Dad did. And now she's like the top student in business.
Okay.
Between you and I, Josh, I'm a little bit excited. And we actually had the university open day yesterday. So her and I were walking through different universities, and she's actually thinking about entrepreneurship. And I just, secretly was just smiling on the inside going, that's super cool for the first woman in my lineage. For I come across people that are 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation entrepreneurs like you and I do, but to actually pass that on is a really important thing for me, whether she wants to become an entrepreneur or not. But just to have that different model of saying, well, I've got Dad that does corporate, Mum that does entrepreneurship, and I don't have to do either, but I have some different models in front of me.
Any sentence from a close family member that starts with, I love you, but I lean forward and see where that's going to go. So you mentioned that there was the silence and the space that you had in your, what ended up being kind of a bit of a solo retreat in Nepal. And I take a week away every year by myself. I go and stay at a friend's place, go away from human beings, no contact, typically a week. And, from silence comes reflection, hopefully, and then often insights I found from that. But you mentioned you were experiencing a lack of the C word, contentment, in your corporate career. That can be quite a hard thing to measure. Were there any other, and I have a mixed audience that listens to this show, from founders to people that are in leadership roles in corporates or medium-sized businesses. What were the signals that you were having that maybe they were conscious, maybe they were things that you had to go looking for properly, that gave you the sign that, this thing wasn't the right path for you to continue on?
It's a really good question. I remember there was one particular day, I love interacting with locals wherever I travel, but I particularly love interacting with children. And somebody had said to me, carry a bag of lollipops because kids love lollipops universally. So our typical day would look like we would walk for 3 or 4 hours. We'd stop, the cook would bring out his little stove and he'd cook me like a little dal and rice or, because we were just carrying a lot of long time food. And then we would walk for a few more hours. And, you'd grab a shady tree, you'd grab your water bottle out. And so it was like typical any day. I can't remember how many weeks we were into the trip, maybe 2.5 weeks into the month. And so again, we'd been walking for a few hours and I remember sitting under a tree, grabbing my water bottle. And I remember this little boy ran up to me. He was about 5. And as he got closer, I thought, oh my God, he's so beautiful, like these beautiful features. And he looked at me and I went, oh yeah, he knows I'm a tourist. He's done this before. And he said, hello. And so I unpacked my backpack and I gave him a lollipop. And most kids would just run away. They would say, thank you. And then they would run off. He just stayed there and we just awkwardly were staring at each other. So cute. And a couple of minutes later, this girl ran up. She was maybe 3.5, and equally beautiful. And I thought, oh, they've got very similar features. I wonder if that's his little sister. And I was just about to reach into my backpack. But I didn't even get a chance. He took a suck of his lollipop. He broke it in half. And he gave her half the lollipop. And then he took his lollipop. He put it back into the wrapper. And he put it into his pocket. And I remember I could see his face anytime I shut my eyes. And he looked at me as if I had just given him $1 million. And I just went, I want what he has. I don't have that. I don't have that level of contentment to give away half of what I have. I don't have that joy of being able to share something like that. And I'll never forget that moment. And when I've reflected on that trip, that is the moment that comes back to me fairly regularly to check in to say, are you really enjoying doing this? Would you be able to give that away? Are you really doing what you love? And I remember thinking he has more than me in his little torn shirt and shorts and no shoes and that beautiful smile and just being able to give away like he didn't even think rather than ask me for another one so he could have a whole. That was a moment I thought that's going to stay with me for a long time. And I can I can see him.
You will.
Any time I share that, I can see him, and I've got to remember that level of contentment. Yeah,
it's a beautiful story. Hey, it's Josh. Thanks for being part of the show. Most founders don't just build one thing; they build many: the company, the team, and hopefully the legacy. JB Ware in New Zealand understands that your exit isn't an ending. It's the bridge to what you build next, whether that's backing the next generation, funding what matters, or creating impact that compounds across decades. The best exits aren't measured in commas alone. They're measured in what those commas enable. 2 Commas is proudly partnered with JB Ware, building wealth that works as hard as you do. What I make that mean, and I want to check in with you whether I've got the right line of thought here, is that the world of the corporate is one that involves, for those that climb it, status and significance. And if you look at the path of the entrepreneur, those things can be tied up in there, but they certainly aren't at the start because it's all about struggle and suffering. It's continuing along with the alliteration there. And maybe at some stage you might experience another S, which is success. But it's a very difficult path to go on. The dominant S that I'm interested in here, and I think this might resonate with you, is the one of service. So when I've had the opportunity to reflect on things, and I've had services companies and product-based platform, technology platform-based businesses, and in every instance there was always an element of service behind those things. And when I was given the time to reflect on things properly and the luxury of being able to have financial freedom in behind it, I realized that the most elevated state for us as a species is if we can find a way to utilize the gifts that we have been given in service of others. Have I kind of headed down the right path there, Shivani? Is that what this means?
Yeah, I think, if I look back on the last sort of 20 years since that, 20 plus years since that moment, there's been paths where absolutely I'm in service. And there's been paths, despite being a founder and running my own businesses, I've gone straight back into the ego, success. Let's buy this, let's pay for that, let's go on this great overseas trip. And I think there have to be some reminders for me, some that life has thrown at me, and others when I've, done my journaling or been meditating or had that time for a little bit of reflection. I go, what am I doing here? I'm back on that. I remember thinking, oh yeah, I want to work for other companies and help them 20 plus years ago. And then I obviously started a couple of my own businesses. And, one of them then started to get bigger and more staff and more revenue and more profit. And I remember thinking, I'm just doing the same thing again. Like I'm back doing this corporate path. I've just called it my own business. I'm super stressed. I'm working crazy hours. I'm getting up in the middle of the night. I'm worrying about my key talent leaving me. What am I doing here? Like I've just recreated the same life, but just under a different umbrella. I'm just telling myself this is better because I'm working for myself and not some corporate, whatever giant. And this is better, but my behaviors and my lifestyle is exactly the same. And so I think the service thing I keep coming back to. And I think, Brian Bro, who is a pretty extraordinary leader in entrepreneurs organization where we met through, he talks a lot about servant leadership. He was the global chair of EO. And I said to him, Brian, so what did you do the year after? And he said, the year after my local chapter asked if I'd be the learning chair because they said, well, you'd have pretty good contacts now that you've been global chair. And I said to him, and what did you do? And he said, I was the learning chair and I did have pretty good contacts after that year. And I thought that was such a beautiful reminder that it's not about the status. When you're serving in that organization. The other thing that happened that I haven't talked about very openly yet to many people, certainly not on a podcast, Josh, is that this year on the 12th of January, my 15-year-old son was having quite a few issues with his jaw. So we'd been to see a dentist and a specialist. And then on the 12th of January, we got the confirmation that it was a bone cancer. So for the last 6 months have probably been certainly the toughest as a parent. And there've been a lot of fear, a lot of worry, a lot of anxiety about helping him. He's currently in a chemotherapy cycle. I flew out from the hospital, stayed with him over the weekend. And I remember when I found out, I just started to go, oh my God, what the hell am I going to do here? And I was on a walk with my dad and I said, look, I've got to drop out of a few of these not-for-profit things. I've got to drop out of some leadership roles and I've got to just take a step back. And he said to me on this walk, he said, Shivani, but you really love serving. And I said, yeah, but I don't have any time, Dad. Like, how am I going to work and how am I going to keep up with this? Our daughter's doing fine, like blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, my experience has been, Shivani, that when you're suffering, you serve. When you're suffering, you serve. And when you serve, it lessens your suffering. So I think this notion of serving has come back pretty strong this year for me. How am I serving my family? How am I serving my clients? How am I serving others? How do I show up? How do I show up better than what I was, 6 months ago? How do I show up more deeper? Because now any time away from the family is even more meaningful than what it was 6 months ago. So you better be doing it for a really good reason. You better be showing up here in Auckland for a really good reason that's really aligned to your purpose and really aligned to making other people's lives better. And so it keeps kind of going in and out, but the last few years it's coming in pretty strong, this whole notion of service. And I'm starting to get what the books I've been reading on servant leadership and the examples of servant leadership more and more. Am I doing it really well this year? I don't know, but I'm more conscious of it than ever before, because any time away from my son, but also my family at the moment, is really important that I decide how I'm going to spend that time. It's not just about a client or work or money. It's got to be really meaningful, sometimes even if it's for free. They've got to just make sure that it's really there in service. So I haven't got it. I'm working on it. But I think I'm working on it more and more as I'm getting older. And I think, that there's that saying that your values are not tested when everything's going well. Your values are tested when everything's going shit, right? And this year it's going shit. And so it's really good to just kind of take stock and go, like what are you going to do and what are you going to work on? And I think there's a lot in servant leadership I still don't know. So I'd like to practice that more as I get older. Like to live it more as I get older.
Mm-hmm. Firstly, thank you for sharing. And secondly, really sorry about that kind of experience that your son and your family is having to go through. Galvanizing, difficult, awful kind of journey to traverse. And I wish you the best of luck in it. Secondly, Tony Robbins, I'll quote here, and it's never left me. If you're in a awful place, I'll paraphrase, if you're in an awful place, go out and find someone who's probably worse off than you and help them. And it'll elevate you out of that place. So that's a very base and core way to look at it. But my life's represented the same things in different ways. And from darkness often comes light, but it comes from finding others that you can help to elevate, solve, whatever it might be. So for those that are unfamiliar, it seems like it's a paradox, and in some ways it is, but there's so much inner goodness and deep innate satisfaction, which I think is ultimately what we're here for, not for happiness. This happiness is a pleasure-based thing. It's, pursuit of something, a moment that's happening. But in reality, I think if we can find contentment and satisfaction, which ultimately comes from this kind of experience, serving others, elevating others, solving things with others, then that becomes a much more ideal state to live in.
Yeah, firstly, thank you. And it's very true because, having spent now almost 100 nights at the Children's Hospital, because not only has he had major surgery, he's had a lot of chemotherapy and he's been really sick. You also realise that there are people that are a lot worse off than us. There's a boy who's the same age who's got cancer riddled through his body. There was another boy who was on the same chemotherapy cycle as us, and I just found out about 3 weeks ago that he passed away. And so I think absolutely you have to put it on the spectrum and go, yes, it's shit, but it's not as shitty as others. And there are a lot more people that are worse off than us that, we were able to catch his cancer early. We've had the best people on it. He's responding to treatment. And I keep telling him that this will pass, right? As that beautiful saying goes, that this too shall pass. And giving him some North Stars to think about for being somebody so young going through that. And, he was meant to move to America this month. He got a scholarship for golf because he's a mad golfer and he couldn't go. And so we keep going, all right, we're somehow going to make that somehow. Don't know how, but we're going to make that work for next year, buddy. It's just a matter of time. But there's other people that are a lot worse than us. That little boy, Zach, that passed away, or other kids that I see suffering so much. I go, you know what? It's actually okay. We are not as bad as others. So yeah, I absolutely agree with haven't been to any of Tony Robbins' stuff. I've just booked in for my first one in September.
Amazing.
I think.
You peed up Unleash the Power Within?
No,
Or
he
Date with Destiny?
he and Steve Bartlett,
Oh, they're doing an AI thing.
they're doing a 2 days like self-development thing in Sydney.
Yes, right.
And so I've just booked for that. That'll be my first ever. I've been invited
Cool.
to so many Tony Robbins things over like 20 years and I've somehow never got to one.
Big fan.
But this will be the first. Okay,
Yeah.
great. That'll be the first one. I've read a couple of his books and they were amazing. And I've listened to the podcast. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
There's no easy way to transition from this conversation, but I'll endeavour to do so with a bit of humour. I don't know if I can quote Lance Armstrong, but he went through a cancer journey himself and he came back stronger and better.
For a little bit.
For a little
Yeah,
bit.
the wrong way.
He had a bit of help. I think probably we all know now that everyone else had the same help. He just did slightly better
I
help than
loved
the
him.
others.
I bought
So did I.
20 of his books,
Oh,
30 of his
Not About
books.
the
I
Bike.
gave them away.
Such a good book.
I
Yeah.
quoted him in different speeches.
Mm.
I was disappointed.
It was the lying. It was the blank-faced and then the kind of
yeah.
manipulating others that were around him that kind of, because everyone knows that all the cyclists at that time, they're all doping up to the eyeballs. It was kind of fairly common knowledge, but it was how he handled the whole thing when it came out.
It was a sad ending, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
To be stripped of all of the stuff. But that's what's happening in our world, right?
Right.
The stuff you could get away with, you can't.
No.
And, do the right thing in the first place, I guess.
100%, exactly. So this is not a spirituality podcast, even though I love that bit of the conversation that we've had. This is a business podcast. So let's go to the early bit of that journey, a couple of those early motions. So you returned from Nepal, you were doing some consulting advisory work by the sounds, but you ultimately started kind of two different tracks. You had your leadership and growth business and speaking, writing. You've written 8 books now and one that's been translated into Mandarin, I believe. Yep. So these are significant achievements that you've had. But you also had the wellness kind of spa business as well. Have I got that correct? Yeah. Which one should we talk about in terms of those early motions of growth? Which were the things that kind of presented you with the most challenge?
I didn't know when I left the corporate world what work it would look like. I kind of fell into coaching, for a better word. And I realized then when I look back, I'd often have people in my office that I'd be asking questions and providing some guidance. And so I fell into that. And I also fell into speaking. A colleague of mine before I left the corporate world had put my name forward for the Telstra Business Women's Awards, which are a big thing in Australia. And I rocked up to the interview and I said, look, I know why my colleague put me down because I'm one of the younger executives in a pretty big company, but I've now quit that job. And so I'm thinking, I'm never going to win this award. Well, I won that year. And then they asked me to speak at a lot of different events. And then eventually somebody offered me money to speak, which I didn't quite understand. And so I've had to do a lot of training on that and continue to. So that was probably the first part of that growth of going, people are asking me to do things and I don't have the skills. So I better go and study. And so I studied some coaching, studied some speaking work, found myself a speaking coach and facilitation and, just started on that journey. And then got married and then had 2 kids and then realized I was traveling most of the week. So I was really fortunate to be able to travel not only in my own country, but also have the opportunity to speak in different countries and was facilitating in different countries. And then had these 2 young babies thinking, maybe I should have more of a local business. And that's where did a due diligence on 3 or 4 different businesses. I looked at a recruitment business, looked at a number of things, and then landed on a wellness business knowing what the wellness industry was doing at the time. So this is probably going back about 14 years ago now. And it's still doing that, wellness industries are still continuing to grow. And thought I'd land there. Didn't really know much about the wellness industry and really struggled. Those first few years were really tough because I thought, should I be more qualified? Will my staff have more appreciation for me? Will they see me more as a serious founder if I, got some qualifications as a masseur, as a beautician? So it took me a long time. I failed so many things. So much of the latest book about, getting your people to step up is all about that, is making all the wrong decisions around hiring wrong people. I was trying to corporatize it and I had to get some other people to help me. So I hired other people consultants and coaches to help me really look at things differently. And one of the things I realized is I have a knack for coaching. So rather than try and become one of the staff and have the same qualifications, why don't I just coach them? Sounds really simple, but it was after hundreds of thousands of dollars of wasting money and not knowing. And once I got that, Josh, that started to click in.
That was the unlock, right?
That was the lock, going, just do what I do well. Just facilitate and coach people and let them be the experts. Hire really smart people and let them do it and empower them where they, asking them questions like, where am I stuffing up? What am I not doing very well? Well, Shivani, you're the bottleneck in hiring process, for example. We're constantly waiting for you to get the second and third interviews done. And because you take so long to get into your diary, we're then missing out on key talent. Great, well, let me get out of the way. And so, when I realized I could coach them to tell me when to get out of the way, when to step in, what I could do better, the business started to grow better. But the idea of that transition was to be home more and have a more localized business. But the part I really loved was, and I still love, is my coaching and speaking and facilitation.
Yeah.
So that was the reason, I guess, why I went into that business.
A quick one while I've got you. You've probably listened to every business podcast going, this one obviously included. And the biggest calls in your business still feel super hard and are yours to make alone. Talking to founders in exactly the spot, what I've worked out is that more content just won't fix this problem. What you need is frameworks that work in a room of people going through the same journey. That's the Comma Club. There's 50 founding places, and when they're gone, the founding rate goes up with them. Please head to joshcomrie.com to learn more. So you started practicing, coaching, fell into speaking opportunistically, which I think a lot of people end up in that place through that kind of route as well. And then you decided to get a proper business, and that ended up having more challenges associated with it than you anticipated. And it was the tool set that you developed outside of that. Often I have the expression, you can't read the label from inside the jar. And so the answer for you was sitting there in the work that you'd done before, but sometimes it's really hard for us to see that. What were the changes that you noted in your team and in your business when you adopted the coaching mindset? I asked that question as we've had this conversation before. I trained and certified as a coach 24 years ago, and it's been a skill set that I've had as a part of a toolbox. And I desired to grow a business as a coach, which I did for a period of time, but I realized the constraints that existed around that for my aspirations at that stage as a 30-year-old. I wanted to do something a bit different. So I went down a different path, but continued to use that toolbox that was available. But the mindset and the tactics, the techniques are not necessarily still today known by everybody. So what was the shift that you noticed in your team when you started to adopt those principles?
There's that very old, I remember the first business book I read was The E-Myth.
I love it. Michael Gerber.
By Michael Gerber. And it was the first time I'd come across the concept of working on the business versus in the business. And I still use that. I still think, am I in or am I out? Am I working on or am I working in? And I think one of the things that coaching allowed me to do was work on the business. So, I'd rock up with, a tray full of coffees and finding out what's happening in people's lives and, what we could do. When I started to coach, I realized I'm going about it the wrong way. I'm trying to kind of influence them, get them to like me, get them to like their workplace. And because they were pretty smart people, what they really wanted to do was to strategically talk about the experience and the wisdom they already had, and for somebody to say, well, what do you think we should do? And when I started to ask more, let's call them coaching type questions, and asking them, so if this was your business, what would you do? What do you think the top 3 priorities are? What's our big focus for this week? Who do you think we should let go? What's missing in our people? Why are we not able to sell products the same in this location versus that location? When I started to ask questions and I listened more, which I think is the role of a coach. I always think when I'm speaking, or being in this podcast, my role is to speak more. And yes, I've got to listen to the question, but my role is to speak more. But for coaching, I had to really, and still do, have to do a lot of work on listening with my whole self, not just listening with my ears, listening with my head and heart. And so I switched, I noticed, from speaking more, from bringing coffees and trying to be the maid and the friend and I want to be, I'm with you, like we're in this together, to asking questions and listening more. They were really smart. They already had the answers. I just wasn't asking the questions. And so what I noticed was the expertise came to the surface. What I noticed were that they got excited. What I noticed were that they automatically then started to come with solutions rather than waiting for me to come up with the solutions. And their solutions were most of the time better than mine because they were from the industry. They'd worked in the wellness industry for 5, 10, one of them 30, 35 years. And so they knew what type of people to hire. They knew what decisions would make the business grow faster. They just hadn't been asked. And for many of them, they had never been asked in other roles that they'd had. So felt like an unearthing of this whole amount of expertise, all this wisdom, all this stuff that was just sitting there that hadn't been lifted. And I know empower is a really, overused term, but really just asking them questions and saying, well, when do you think we can get that done by? What do you think we should do? They're like, well, I can do this by this, this, and then. So I had to do less. And I noticed that the weight lifted off my shoulder of trying to be the person that had to find all the answers, because often when I started, I was the HR marketing founder, decision maker, like all those challenges that we have as founders, and realize actually they can do up like 90% of these roles. And I'm actually needed very less. I actually need to get out of the way. Now I had to put some constraints in terms of what money we spent or, other delegations of authority, but most of that they could do. That's the big shift I noticed, was listening, asking questions and letting them come up with the solutions.
People feel valued if you ask them meaningful questions. If you have the whole, perfunctory throwaway questions, then you don't really get to the right level. But if you ask them their opinion, their insight, to draw from their experience, it not only makes them feel more connected to the work that they're doing, but also gives them a high sense of ownership of the outcomes that they're responsible for. And it doesn't just become a measure or a thing that sits on a KPI or on a scorecard or on a job description. And the ownership leads to greater freedom for the founder because they've got others that are around them that are experiencing more growth, more ownership of their role. And so therefore you can kind of go off and do the other things that count for you and work on the business, as Michael Gerber would say. I love also the questions that you're asking were a mix of coach and consultant, which is a very smart approach. We spend millions, thousands, depending on the scale of your business, to bring others in as the external expert. But the classic consultant playbook is to spend a couple of weeks going around the business, asking all the individual contributors and the leaders, what are we doing well? What could we improve? We could introduce one product, one offering. What would that thing be? And essentially you operate it as a mix of the coach to support and grow and guide people, but also the person who was looking for the gaps and the opportunities in the business, which was inside their observations and their experience. So great playbook.
Thank you. And I think I realized that when the leadership team, the key leadership team, trusted each other and they needed opportunities to connect, they executed better. So then the role I decided to go was, how can I engineer trust? How can I get them talking about the difficult things, whether it's people or process or money or growth? How could I get them talking about the difficult things? Because the more they could do that, the more they seem to solve the problems themselves. And it wasn't, I don't remember thinking, Josh, I wasn't as clever to go like as you made me out to be, that, I'm a consultant now and I'm a coach now. I wish. But I also knew what I wasn't doing very well. Because, when in the corporate work, I had people that I could delegate to. And I don't know why, but as a new founder, And I founded other businesses. One was a complete disaster, but, the other one worked. But I also remember thinking, well, I have to, this is my business, so I must have the answers. And it took me a long time to think through, because I often think of I love trees, and I think of the root system. And I think of, the tree gets fed from the roots. They're the foundation of the tree. And so I must feed all the answers. I must feed the growth. I'm the person that it needs to go through. And then I realized, I'm only one of the root systems. In fact, probably a minor root system. And when I started to recognize that my key leaders were the people that could actually make this tree or this business grow much, much faster than having, visualizing the water or the fruit nutrients coming from one root. Actually, there were 6, 7, 8 of us that could do this. And if they could do that, then the business grew a lot faster, which it did.
Yeah, yeah. There's a word that, term that Google has popularized, which is psychological safety. And the consciously or not, that's what we really desire from our workplace, because if we feel psychologically safe, we can contribute, we can challenge, we can ask questions. And I think you talked about engineering trust. It sounds like those two things are probably kind of parallel. And you mentioned engineering trust so that we can have the difficult conversations. And actually, to me, that's how you engineer trust, is by having the difficult conversations. So those two things are kind of not one leads to the other, but rather two sides of the same coin, perhaps. So the business started to go the direction that you wanted it to go. At what stage did you start to entertain the notion of going, is this a thing that I want to sell? How long do I want to hold all this for? What was the part in the journey where you decided that to ultimately end up with the exit?
I had set myself a pretty unrealistic goal of 10xing the business. And it was nowhere near that in the first sort of few years. And I had said, when I 10x it, I'm out. And then I 10x it. And then it was, my greed started to come in. Some of my family members started to go, it's going so well. You've worked so hard to get it going now. Why not stay? Why not 15x it or 20x it? And one of the things I noticed for me was, we were up to sort of about 70 staff. The rents were going up. My enjoyment was going down. And, to go back to that Nepal trip, I remember thinking, I'm back in this little game again. When is enough enough? You'd said you were going to do it. This is my conversation with myself. You said you were going to exit with 10x. You 10x'd it now, 11x'd it. Now what? Just get out, do other things. So I didn't want to stay in the comfort of the money coming in, of having finally built something. And I, might not sound that businessy, Josh, but my intuition, and I know that some leaders talk a lot about trusting the intuition, whether it comes to hiring people, whether it comes to making certain decisions. My intuition was this was the time to go. This is what you'd said. You've now achieved it. Now what? Let it go. Because there's other things that are going to come in, but I don't know what those other things actually are. The other thing that I started to do was I started to talk to some other people about exits, and a lot of them shared with me that it was a really good idea to take a sabbatical. And the idea of a sabbatical terrified me, because I'm good at stopping for a little bit each day and doing my little daily rituals and doing my meditation and doing my journaling and reading, etc. But to do it like a 6-month sabbatical seemed a bit crazy and a bit nutty. But I thought that would also be really good to go, okay, what does the next phase of life look like? It just felt like it was that next version that was ready. So I just trusted that intuition, even though maybe financially wasn't the smartest decision. I think I could have kept growing and probably accelerating the growth now that I knew what I was doing a bit more after 10 years. And but it didn't feel like money's never been my number one driver, because otherwise I wouldn't have left the corporate role in the first place, where I had lots of opportunities and shares and everything else. And I just felt like it was time to let that go. Just trust it. That's the goal you set. You've achieved it. Just be done.
Yeah.
Don't get greedy.
I think it was Malcolm Gladwell in Blink where he talks about intuition. Blink is essentially like a decision-making and a recognition kind of patterns book. And he's got this, and I hope I've got the book right, but he's got this stanza in there where he talks about a art expert who walks into a gallery and there's a fake that's hanging on the wall. And she just said it felt wrong. I couldn't describe in which way it was wrong, but it just felt wrong. And that's intuition, right? And so what he says, and I'll kind of essentially butcher the version of it, is that if you've been doing something for long enough, and if you have enough depth of understanding, experience around that thing, then your intuition should be trusted. It's when we have intuition about something that we don't know anything about that it can get us into trouble, I'd suggest. But in your business, you'd be doing it for what, 10 years at that stage?
It was 10 years at that
10
stage.
years, yeah, okay. Yeah.
And I just, I wasn't enjoying it. You know, I'd often wondered why was running a wellness business made me feel a bit mentally unwell at times. Why was I stressing about, you know, because obviously we just experienced COVID through the whole business as well, where I thought, oh my God, we're going to go bankrupt. All our, you know, particularly in big shopping centres, we still had to pay 60% of the rent even when we were shut. That was what the government had decided. And so I could see my cash reserves disappearing. Now, the great thing with the wellness business was, which we didn't know at the time, was when we started to come out of COVID, wellness was where a lot of people put their money. So our ticket items went, you know, and very quickly doubled and then tripled. And so I could see that going, do you want to risk that again? You're not enjoying it anymore. Do you really want that mental strain? This is not why we started the business in the first place. And just, you know, that was a promise I'd made to my younger self, was that when you 10x'd it, you were out. So get out. Yeah.
Good on you. And it sounds like the timing, if you put aside the COVID blip, which none of us could foresee, but the coming back into the business and then average customer transaction, I'd imagine, went through the roof. Yeah, wonderful. So the exit itself, was it a classic kind of advisory broker kind of journey that you contacted, or was it something that fell into your lap? How did the transaction come to play itself?
Yeah, look, the next part is probably going to sound super nerdy because I'm super nerdy anyway. But I decided to speak to a few people that had exited their business. And that led me to them connecting me to other people that had led their business. Anyway, before I knew it, I talked to about 15 people who had exited their business. And I asked them the same questions. You know, what did you sell your business for? Did you have a broker? Did you do a multiple of your EBIT? Did you hire a broker? What would you do again? What would you never do again? You know, what were your key learnings? Those sort of standard questions. And then I put them into an Excel spreadsheet. And then there's this magical nerdy number of 28 that if you get past 28 sample sizes, it's like you've spoken to 230,
right,
300 people.
Yeah.
So I went, let me just keep going and speak to another 13 people. I'm already at 15.
Mm-hmm.
And so that process took me about 4 or 5 months. And then I put all of their learnings into the Excel spreadsheet and found the 3 most common learnings.
Okay.
And then put them into the exit, and I was able to get an extra 25%.
Huh.
It was like getting a little mini diploma, I think, in exits. It was so cool.
I mean, 25% is meaningful as well, right?
Hugely meaningful and so generous. Not one person that I asked, most people I didn't know, who just referred me to other people, who referred me to other people. And, you know, some were 30-minute conversations, some were 2.5-hour, 3-hour conversations. And I just had so many learnings around that. And so because I knew how to start businesses, I didn't know how to exit. And so that process was super helpful to me. And so because I'd learned what people regretted, what people did well, what were the same things people did well, then I was able to apply into the exit. I knew what I was looking for. I knew the number that I wanted. So I wrote myself one of those blank checks, you know, printed from the internet. I put that up. I always do a vision board. So I put that up on my vision board. The hard thing was staying in the business once mentally I felt I was out, because I was like, I'm so done with this business. I'm so bored. I want to be sold tomorrow. And that didn't work so well, because when I talked to the people, they said, don't start another new business. That was one of the key learnings. Don't start anything new until the money hits the bank.
Yeah. And even then.
And that took almost a year.
Yes.
And so the process I went through was I got really clear from those conversations what I wanted in my exit. I didn't care who I sold to. But what was the other thing that was really clear to me is that I wanted every single one of my employees to have a contract. I didn't want somebody to come in and decimate and start cost cutting. And so I had one potential buyer that the number looked like it was going to reach, but they were not willing to give a contract to all the staff. So I let that go.
Mm-hmm.
So I think by doing that work and that clarity on what I wanted at the end, because I was so clear about that vision, that really helped me go yes, no very quickly to different suitors, buyers that came in. And then it came down to the two. And in the end, was the first person that really made the deal. They were also happy to take over the leases, which was always a little bit of a worry from longevity of that perspective. And that's what I ended up doing. But just got very clear on the criteria, and that really helped rather than get greedy. Like somebody offered me more money than what I wanted, but it didn't meet the other couple of criteria that I had. So just that, I always, if anybody now asks me, I'll go, just get really clear on your criteria. And once you've got it, done.
Yeah. I love it. I wrote about it in the book that founders spend on average 20,000 hours building their business and less than 100 strategizing and thinking about their exit, which is such an asymmetry, right? Because the other thing that I say is that you will exit this business one day. It will either by default or by design. Either carry you out from a box because you've died whilst you're in the chair, and I hope that happens to no one, or you might get foreclosed, even worse, or you'll decide to sell it. So you'll be out of the door some stage, so you may as well think about that and be conscious about it. The question that most people that are listening and watching this will have is, as far as you recall, what were the key lessons that enabled you to increase either the multiple or the ask, the thing that added that 25%? Was there a couple of things that were there that were really, really helpful for you that you could apply into that process and see a better outcome?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first one sounds really simple, but I hadn't done it. And that was to squeeze every line item.
Right.
I hadn't done it.
Yeah. Cool.
I had squeezed what I thought were key line items. And that process took a while.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't about selling and getting that high multiple by reducing your stock to 0 levels or stop paying yourself at the end. Like I wanted it to be a realistic, but I also wanted to stretch that. And that took a few months.
Yeah, of course.
To squeeze,
see the flow through, right?
Every line item. The second part also became, do I involve my key leaders through the selling process? Or are they going to get frightened and leave, which is often a challenge for founders going through an exit process. And I thought, well, I've spent so much time talking about trust and openness and transparency and leadership and coaching. It would be kind of the opposite of my behavior and my values if I didn't. So what I decided to do was share that with 3 of them and we talked about setting some bonus structures in place. That if they stayed through the exit, and I'd be really transparent. If it wasn't working, I'd be transparent. If it looked like it was going to go to the next stage, I'd be really transparent. And that really helped. Even though I was so worried about it, thinking they might go, okay, well, if she's out, I'm going to start looking for that. And I knew that the business really needed those key leaders in it. That was a really important part and a feature of the selling. So the new owner knew that they didn't have to come in and set all of that up. And I'm glad I made the decision that way. And yes, the risk was there to be able to do that. So working on that narrative, working on the storytelling, certainly brought in all my speaking skills into that. I remember practicing it, 25, 30 times in front of the mirror, which I normally would do in my speaking practice, and really working out how could I inspire them to stay, not just from a bonus and a money perspective, but being part of that narrative, being part of the storytelling. And that was really important for me to making sure that they got it.
Yeah.
And they also knew the people that I said no to, I also shared that with them, saying, for example, look, the number hit, but they were not willing to do the contract. So they also established some trust through that process where they went, she's actually sticking to what she's talking about. She's sharing, even letting that go, even her number, she could have just sold it at that point. But she told us that was really important, and the fact that she's let that particular person go because they'd met that potential buyer. and taking them through some of the details of the business, and that she was willing to let that go. And I think that established some trust. I know it wasn't ideally what they all wanted in terms of me exiting, but that was, that decision wasn't up for debate. It was more about who to and how the process was managed.
Mm-hmm. There's a mental model which sits in behind this, which is the if you were to think about your business through the lens of the buyer, and the first thing that you did and you talked about there is it's most likely a buyer would come in and go, we're all wasting money. And so they would do that cost trimming thing. And of course, the remarkable thing about saving $1 is that you don't just save $1, that flows straight to the bottom line. So if you're running at a 10% margin, which is a pretty good margin for a business, net margin, $10 million, $1 million into the bottom line, if you save $1, that's literally another $1 on the bottom line. A lot of people in there, when they're stuck in the quagmire of their business, they don't necessarily think about it that way. So I really like that. Second piece, which I love and relate to, is the narrative piece. And I suspect that the narrative that you had for the team, your key staff members, and the retention that was sitting at the end of it for them would also have played into the narrative that you had around the positioning of the business and the asset itself, because they're kind of two of the same things. Hey, this is the journey we're going to go on. This is what it means for you at the end of it. This is why this is a great opportunity for you. And then the same story can be played out to potential buyers. And I think that I know many people get that piece wrong. They don't understand clearly that people are buying not just the spreadsheets, because if that's what they're buying, you're going to get a not great outcome from it. You'll get the average of what those businesses will sell for. They're buying a story. Why did you start this thing? Where is this thing going? Why is this thing so much more special than the competition? And so being able to craft and explain that to people is such a great thing. So 25% average uplift, because I'd imagine in the wellness space, it's not like there would be none of those businesses sold in a year, right? There'd be a bit of a regular bit of data that you could go back and refer to. So 25% above average is a wonderful, wonderful outcome that puts you in the top quartile of anything. So well done.
Thank you. And you're absolutely right around the narrative. And I mean, again, I didn't realize that skill set that I'd picked up in my other business would come in so handy. And I think the storytelling is such an important part. When founders say to me, I'm like, exactly what you've just said, Josh. Like, put yourself in there. What is the story? Because the other thing we were able to do is talk about where there was potential growth for the next 3 years after I exited. And so that was part of the storytelling, because you went, actually, there's some savings here. I think we can do this better. We can automate this, but there's also some growth opportunities there. So when you can show them genuine projections of where that business can go without you, and that's built into the storytelling, they can see the upside of you not being there, but the fact that that team can then carry on that vision and implement some of those, opportunities that exist.
Yeah.
So I think, and somebody had said that to me early on. A number of the founders I'd spoken to who'd all exited within about 2.5 years had shared that with me, that narrative, and I went, great. So before I go and develop documents, let me actually do one of the things I know how to do is to develop a PowerPoint presentation with stories of the, that early start, the why, the what exists, the fact, and that thing that we've been speaking about.
Yes.
That nobody tells you at the beginning of starting a business.
No, they don't. The crude way to describe what you were talking about there was leave some money on the table for the acquirer, leave some growth, leave some profit extraction for them so they can see what they might be able to get from it, hint to it or talk to it directly. Mentioned that your business objective when you got into the business was to 10x what it was. You got to 11 around about when you ultimately decided to sell it. But that represents exponential growth. Before we got into the conversation, we were talking about what you're up to now and what you're noodling on, which is exponential growth. So let's get into that subject matter.
In terms of what I'm doing now?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I did on my 6-month, very challenging sabbatical, a lot of people go, oh, you were so lucky. I go, oh my God, taking 6 months out was excruciating for me. I mean, I've worked since I was 14, Josh. And,
so I thought that'd be around.
I'm pretty good at stopping, as I said, for little pieces. To stop for 6 months where I think I had a yoga class at 9:30 and pick up the kids at 3:30. And I think after about the first 3 weeks, the kids and my husband were like, can you stop cooking? There's enough food to feed the street. I'm like, I don't know what to do. But I'd also made a deal that I would not start something for 6 months, and I'd let and I wanted to be held accountable for that because I was bored and my ego was like, what are you doing here? And to be honest with you, I had to hire a psych. I hired a psych that worked with me every few weeks to work on my identity because I'd lost this identity of being, well, you're the first entrepreneur in the family, of the blah, 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 all these different hats that I had, because when I lost my identity, I didn't know how to define myself anymore. People are like, what do you do? I'm like, I cook and I pick up my kids, and I've never done this before. I mean, I worked through both my pregnancies and had very little time off. And so it was a bit of a, who am I stage, and a little bit of who do I want to be in the future. And so after a very excruciating 6 months of a sabbatical, I did a full circle. One of the things I realized is that I really love coaching, and I really love coaching leadership teams. And how could I help others have similar, but ideally even way more success than I had? How could I help them scale? And, we hear about these words, growth mindset, a lot, that were coined by, Carol Dweck, and schools are talking about them, organizations talk about that. And I've recently been listening to Benjamin Hardy, who wrote, 10x is easier than 2x, and he's written a new book on scaling. And it's been fascinating for me to look at the growth mindset versus a scaling mindset. Growth mindset is incremental. It's being open and curious to new things. And, Benjamin Hardy doesn't call it the scaling mindset, but, he talks about what if you want to 100x your business? Because when you want to 100x, when you want to grow, you look at the past and look at where you can go. When you want to 100x it, you look at where you could be, and then you kind of reverse engineer it. And I'm fascinated by this. And I've been nerding out on a bunch of podcasts and a bunch of different books. And so I'm really interested in working, and I've been working with I've got the privilege of working with a bunch of companies to help them scale. But then again, engineering trust in that leadership team, and so that they can execute faster and scale faster. So that's the work I've now been doing for the last couple of years and really loving it. And I remember the wonderful Steve Jobs used to talk about, you can't connect the dots till later on in life. When he took that calligraphy class, I remember watching that. He said, I didn't know why I was taking it. I was failing uni. But that became the keyboard for Apple. And I didn't realize, having scaled businesses, exited them, having done speaking, having done, my MBA and did a lot of work around strategic planning, I didn't know that those dot points were going to lead to the work now. But I'm taking so much joy and pleasure in helping companies scale. It's been so great. When companies go, we want a 3x or 10x this, I go, that's so great.
Yes.
And how can we do that together?
Yeah. Your answer may be engage you, have a conversation with you, but I'm going to ask the question nonetheless. So I read the book, 10x is easier than 2x. And I love the notion and the audacity, really, of it. And it was a real kind of seed planter for me, but also others that I've introduced the book to as well. My takeaway from it is that it was much less practical and much more imaginative possibilities, The Art of Possibility, which is another great book. The realm of expanding your mindset and what could be achievable, and visualization, it was much more about that than it was about tactics. If there was a tactic that I could ask you about, if someone wanted to go scaling, do that. Is that a contact Shivani question, or is there something that you might be able to share?
Yeah, both. So happy to, share and all the things I've been nerding out on. But also I think that when you start to do the scale stuff, the question is it opens up your imagination a bit. Whereas growth feels more incremental.
Yeah, mechanical, incremental.
And I think it's not one or the other. I think it's both. It's that and that. It's not that or that. And so I think then having a stretch goal that says, what I love about the scaling question is to say, well, maybe there's a product we haven't invented. Maybe there's a service that we're not taking care of at the moment that our current customers would buy if we had that service. That often doesn't come from just a growth question. The growth question is we're doing, 5.7 mil, how do we get to 7 mil? We're doing 10 mil, how do we get to 15 mil? Oh my God, a stretch goal would be 18 mil. The scaling question says, well, what would 57 million look like? What would we be doing if we were 5.7 and we 10x that? What would 100x look like? Oh my God, that'd be like over $500 million. And so what that does, it just kind of lifts, I find for me, just lifts that lid off my head to say, well, that's a crazy question. Let's whiteboard that. What are some of the things that we'd be doing? And it's not about giving up where you are, but about asking the scale question and then going to the growth question. One of the things I've been finding tactically is that, well, actually, it no longer looks like 7 million. You know what? We think we can get to 15 pretty quickly. And so by asking that question, then come back to growth, it shifts the mindset whether it's 10x or 5x or 3x, but it opens up people's possibilities and it asks them the question of what is possible, and then let's be realistic about it.
Yeah.
But the realistic thing stops being an increment. That's the thing I've noticed working with the companies going, what would you be doing differently? Oh my God. And they become childlike, and then we're brainstorming all these different ways that you could scale it. Now let's get really realistic. If you're sitting at, let's say 10 million, and this is what you potentially could be doing at 100. What if we were running at 20 million? And so then it seems all of a sudden the leadership team go,
well, that seems easy.
Well, that seems possible.
Yeah, right.
Now it's almost possible. Whereas when you said to a leadership team, let's double, they go, whoa.
We struggled to make 10% for the last 3 years. Yeah,
Calm
right.
down here, right? So that's what I'm noticing, the shift by just asking those couple of questions. And I've got a whole heap of stuff to read more and learn more, to be able to help more businesses around that. But I've just noticed it's lifting the lid a little bit.
Yes.
And they're growing faster as a result.
I love it. This is your latest book, the Getting Your People to Step Up. Yep. The camera there. Couple of quick gists and takeaways from this book.
I broke it into 7 key lessons I learned, most of them by failure. One of them was, I'd had people say to me, if the person isn't right, fire fast. So I talk about the fact that the key learning I had was don't hire fast, fire fast, hire really slow, and then fire really slow. And
fire slow?
And fire slow, right?
Okay.
Invest in them. Make sure you coach them. Make sure they've got the right things before we go, no, we're done with you.
Yep.
Now, if they're not right and their behaviours aren't right, then we do that. And we've heard that saying, hire for attitude, train for skill. I talk about that. The second thing I talk about is maybe as a takeaway is that, a lot of people talk about high passionate people, but how do you measure it? So one of the things I've done is develop what I call the passion map, which becomes an interview question, where you get them to identify how do they spend their time outside of work. Takes them about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. You can tell the ones that are trying to bullshit you very quickly. And I talk about the fact that then you actually know that their work doesn't have to be their number one passion. But if I can then as a founder learn to feed their passion. So I remember hiring somebody and they said, look, Shivani, health and body is my number one passion. I'd love for it to be able to say it's work, but it's not. It's my number 2 passion. I love that honesty in that interview. I said, great. So how do you live your passion? Oh, well, I exercise 7 days a week. I've got a little goal of running a mini marathon, et cetera, et cetera. So what I then started to do was build in incentives for that person around their passions. So for her, I paid for the top gym membership for the 6 years that she was with me. And she just loved the fact that I picked up a gym membership as her incentive. There's no point buying people a, ham or a hamper, what they're not going to use. So then building in incentives, but understanding my key people's passions and feeding that and saying, I need it to be work and return, but let me feed that passion. Now, if work's number 7, no, thank you. I don't want you in my business. But as long as work's in their top 3 or 4, I can then feed it, have more transparent, honest conversations about it. So one of the ways I was able to do was tap into this, abstract thing and make it pretty concrete and give people a model as part of the interview questions, which I talk about as well. And that helped me retain my key talent for longer because I was able to feed what was really important to them and they were able to feed what was really important to me.
Yeah.
And we just talked about it. Honestly, work doesn't have to be your number one passion.
Mhm.
At least don't pretend it to be,
Yes.
because it's not anyway. I'm going to find out soon enough. But if we could have that conversation in an interview and you could tell me where work's at and I could feed that and I could incentivize you based on that, that seemed to work really well for me to retain key talent.
Yeah. I love what you've done there. Charlie Munger says, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And there's this trope almost, which is in leadership, which is how do you motivate people? And you find out what they want and then you show them the path to getting it. And so what you've done is you've connected up the kind of abstract notion of what that thing is and related it to their direct interest in their passions, the gym, pursuit, bigger, better, faster, whatever she was trying to achieve, and then connected that back in with the work thing and then given her an incentive around it. So I really like the practical application of it. So I look forward to reading the book, Shivani. My parting question for podcast guests always is that there's an alternative Shivani, different universe. There's dozens of you, but this one particularly has found deep career satisfaction. It's not the path that you've been on. It's an alternate career path. What does that alternate career look like for that Shivani?
There are moments I think I would have been super happy. I would never change not being married or being a mum. But I also would have been super happy volunteering and building houses through Nepal for the underprivileged. And I occasionally think, some point in my life, I think I'll want to do more service, more volunteer, more. And my deep passion is probably educating girls in third world countries, because I felt that I was so privileged to have a very educated family, a father that really believed in educating girls and women in the family, and look at the opportunities I've had. And so, you know, for the last 20 years, there's a small percentage of all our profits that have gone into supporting girls having an education and finishing school and not being married early. And, you know, that also links into them not suffering sort of violence and abuse at an early age as well. But I think that would have been, there would be some alternatives about doing more of that. And I mean, I don't have any regrets, Josh. Like, you know, what would an alternative universe, you know, but, you know, there's this, I've been doing some reading on quantum physics and I think it's fascinating. There could be all these parallel universes, not to have weird conversations on this podcast, but we might as well. And I think, well, imagine like if there was like lots of me, like what other impact could we have in parallel universes as well? And if it was in this universe, how could I multiply and create and have more leaders that could have more impact? So it fascinates me to work with leaders that have got more purpose and that can have ripple impacts through being founders or whatever businesses that they're running. So, you know, people go, how do you limit your one-on-one coaching? And I said, but if I can work with somebody that's having some pretty amazing impact, and if I could impact him or her or them, that's pretty cool. I don't have to impact 1,000 people. That person, by unlocking something, can then impact thousands of people. So that's the question I always ask is, how could I keep helping other people that could keep passing the work down? Because at some point I'll be gone. And then what does that look like afterwards?
Yeah, I love it. As leaders, we can either cast a shadow or we can cast light. There's the expression, you know, don't pull the ladder up behind you, is another kind of aphorism in this kind of space. And so clearly to me, what you're indicating is that, you know, your choice is to cast the light and show others how to do the same thing. And so I love what you're up to. I look forward to reading the book. I'm so pleased we got to have this conversation whilst you're in NZ. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Shivani.
Thank you for having me and making it work.
Thanks so much for listening to the show. If you've gotten this far, I reckon you've probably enjoyed it. And there's more available for you in the form of my book, 2 Commas. It's available on my website, joshcomrie.com. I've done an Audible version, which is on amazon.com, and there's a Kindle one kicking around on either of those resources as well. I've had some wonderful, unsolicited feedback from early readers. They describe it as being punchy, clear, helpful, and actionable. What it's not is a guide on how to sell your company. You can go to ChatGPT for that. It's more insightful, experiential-based, and a bit of a blend of psychology, philosophy, and what it takes to build something meaningful and what all that means afterwards. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you grab yourself a copy.